you. Happy Saturday, everybody. Welcome to the unique challenges of design systems at scale. Just to note, this is not going to be a deep into code development talk. In the past, I've had developers come in and be very disappointed in this talk. So I'm giving that little tidbit at the very beginning with the idea of like, if you're a developer and you are hoping to get deep into Storybook or like structure and design tokens, it's okay if you want to leave. Like, I won't look the other way, and I won't take it hold it against you. So this is mostly going to be a design and content talk. So my name is Witkowski. I'm an associate director for Lullabot. Lullabot is not based in Buffalo, it's a distributed company. And we work with clients that have large content needs for development, design, and strategy agency. And you may be thinking to yourself, holy crap, I am so sick of hearing about design systems, right? Because they're all over the place. Every article, every video, every talk is about design systems. I'm hoping this one will be a little bit different because it's kind of more of a rant than it is it being rainbows and sunshine and unicorns, because if you've ever worked in a design system before, you know that sometimes you just want to hit your head against the wall. So, and this is about those moments. So, here's the backstory of how this talk came about. I had just come off a project where I had worked 3.5 years working closely with the Carbon design system. If you're not familiar with Carbon, it's an open source design system that IBM has. So they use it within the company of IBM. Anybody can actually download it and use it for any type of launching point for a product marketing or product website. But as I mentioned before, it isn't just any design system. It is open source, which means you have to be very, very careful on how you add things, update things when it comes to components. This design system also had to do a lot. It scaled vastly across the company into product, marketing, documentation, external and internal tools, social media. I mean, its breadth was gigantic. But the system itself was very, very small. During my tenure, I experienced the system as an adopter, contributor, and a consultant. And I thought it was a unique experience that I got to go through all three of those roles with this design system. I also helped to manage a temporary design system where I helped create a governance and contribution models. I'll talk a lot more about this temporary design system and how it went in the next slide. And then while doing this, I worked closely with the core design library teams to help shape future components. To say I learned a lot while I was on this project was a complete understatement. Going into the project, I was like kind of naive about, oh, this is gonna be great. And then when I left, like my hair was sticking up and I was like, oh my God. So I wanted to share what I had learned. And I was thinking of how I could share this. I did some research, and I noticed that a lot of talks, like we're focusing on those rainbows and unicorns of how to set up a design system, and if you do it this way, everything is going to be fantastic. And that was not the truth. That was not the truth that I had. And talking with designers and developers who work in systems design, they also had the same feeling. So I want to talk specifically about how to predict and plan the future when it comes to design systems, because these things grow, they evolve, and if you don't set it up right in the very beginning, it's going to fall flat on its face. And here's why that's important. I mentioned I have helped to manage a temporary design system during my 3.5-year tenure while I was working with Carbon. And the system was created for a single product marketing website. I think at the time it was Watson Health, which isn't part of the IBM product line anymore. But everybody, all the other products, loved this design system so much that they wanted to use it. And so everybody got the okay, and this design system started to scale. It scaled to over 100 products. As you can imagine, it did it very, very quickly. We really do not have a plan in place for this. And this product marketing website, it was designed for specific, unique business needs. You know, Watson Health had unique business goals that they wanted to hit with this design system. They had unique users of this design system. None of that was taken into account when this started to scale. So, this design system grew to over 90 components. And if you're not familiar with design systems, that's a lot when it comes to components. As you can imagine, it became super difficult to maintain. There was developers couldn't maintain the components. It was very hard to scale. Nobody could contribute back to the components. There was duplicate components in the system, we found out. And so this is kind of how I felt in the very end. I felt like this guy here, where like a fire would pop up as we were onboarding this product, and that fire got put out. And then another fire popped up over here, but then this one continued to pop up, and I was not given the right tools at all to manage this. So, and this is how this talk was formed. So, let's talk a little bit about challenges with design patterns and scale. And when I talk about design patterns and scale, I'm actually talking just about the components themselves that make up the system. I'm going to talk about challenges with maintaining a system of systems at scale, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. It's basically about breaking up your system into more digestible chunks. I'm going to talk about naming systems at scale. This is going to be a good one. I love talking about naming, mostly because it's probably one of the hardest parts when it comes to design systems. I'm going to talk about content flexibility at scale. I am not a content strategist, so I'm not going to get too much on the weeds on this one, but I do think there are certain things that we can look out for as design systems designers and developers. And then finally, I'm going to talk about adoption at scale. There's a lot of great resources out there, and honestly, like, these resources are fantastic, so I'm not going to get too much into details on this one, plus this is only supposed to be a 35-minute talk. So I'm going to touch on it a little bit, but it's not going to be like a huge section. And for the purpose of this talk, when I mention a design system at scale, what I don't mean is that the design system is gigantic, it's 90 plus components, right? Because we want to avoid that. What I do mean is that the design system has to scale beyond a single use case into multiple different products and applications. And each application has its own purpose, user need, and business requirements. It typically happens in larger companies, and I made a handy diagram to illustrate this. So our design system's at the top. It scales to product, marketing, documentation, maybe a content management system, maybe a point of sale, maybe a customer relationship management system like Salesforce. Some of these may have subsystems underneath it. So product may have a native web application, but it also may have a mobile application. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to use product, but this can scale to things like university websites, where you have a design system that has to service different schools and departments, or government websites where you have to have a design system that services different types of agencies. So let's dive in and start with challenges with design patterns at scale. So, the first big challenge is managing the conflict between flexibility and consistency when it comes to expanding component features. And I'm going to use the card component to illustrate this. I know we all love to hate cards. Everybody, I've had my issues with cards in the past. So Nathan Curtis, who is a design systems expert, had a great example of cards gone out of control in a talk he gave at a conference called Schema a few years back. And I've added a link to this at the end of this presentation in a resources slide. So say you have a basic card component, and let's give it a container, spot for an image, and some headline text. And this works okay in the system for a while. Everybody loves this card. But then team A comes over to you and they're like, hey, you know, we need more variation in this card. Like, we want to add some subtitle text and an area for body copy. And you're like, you know what? Yeah, that's okay. You know, why didn't we add that in the original card? So you go ahead and add it, and you call it variation A. By the way, we'll talk more about naming a little bit later, about how this is an awful name. So this works out great for a while. Everybody's chugging along with their design systems. But then Team B comes to you and they're like, hey, we need a card that supports a thumbnail. Like this large image isn't working for us. We have different needs. And you're like, okay, like let's give you a card with a thumbnail. And you know, just to be like helpful design systems experts, we're gonna give you the option to align it left or right. This works out great. Everybody's happy. But then Team C comes to you and they're like, well, like, we have to put logos in these cards, and this thumbnail image doesn't work because it's fixed. And logos come in all shapes and sizes, and if we put it in the thumbnail image, it's going to start cutting off logos, which is bad. So we need a card. At this point, you start thinking to yourself, like, like, do we go back and try and change variation B so it supports logos? But this team's already using that card, so who knows what the implications of changing it up is for them. So you go ahead and you add that card. And then Team D comes to you and they need a pricing card with a whole new set of features. And at this point you're like, what the heck just happened? You have a card, and now we have all this complexity that gets added to this card. So the reason why this happens is because, you know, we want users to adopt the system. So we want it to become flexible. But the thing we have to keep in mind is that the more flexibility things have, the harder it becomes to maintain as a systems designer. So what can we do to help remedy this? So we have to think about the approach and structure the design system by simplifying features where necessary. Again, this is me not giving adopters all the features they need. Absolutely not. Remember, we want them to adopt the system. So in his talk, Nathan Curtis suggested breaking down the system into smaller subcomponents, which might be the key. So instead of providing a card with all the features, just provide a base card and provide guidance for how teams could use that base card to create their own cards. For example, the base card could be a container or a background, and then the system itself provides guidance for how it handles things like imagery, text, icons, etc. And this gives the tools for other teams to build their own cards off the base card. In fact, you can interchange flexibility versus consistency with efficiency versus expansion. There's always this tension around trying to keep the system sleek and efficient versus expanding the system while in turn making it more complex. Keeping it small and efficient can also help keep components more consistent, but expanding the system can add more flexibility, but also introduces that inconsistency. So finding the right balance and determining when and how to expand the system can be challenging. You know, when is that tipping point? And how can we better prepare for expanding the system in a more consistent manner? So, encouraging teams to build pattern libraries off the base or core level system can help alleviate some of those challenges with flexibility while still keeping things consistent within the system itself. For example, you have your core design system. Team A can create their product library from it. Team B, their marketing library. Team C, their documentation library. Team D, their CMS library, and it can go on. And some of these could have their sub-libraries underneath it. So the product library could feed into a native web app library and also a mobile app library. So the advantages of using pattern libraries include less maintenance. It puts ownership on specific teams to maintain, document, and create governance models around it. It's easier to update. Components are simplified, less to maintain. More control. Components at the base level feed into those pattern libraries. And finally, validation. You can have teams like test components before they get contributed up to the core system. For example, you may have a card that other teams may want to use, contribute it back to core, but that card really hasn't been tested. So have this team test it in their own pattern library, get analytics on it, get engagement levels on it, to see if anything needs to be changed before contributing back up to the core library. This is a great quote from Yogi Berra, who was a baseball player. New York Yankees, 1960s and 50s. You don't know where you're going, so you'll wind up somewhere else. You have to take the time at the very beginning to think about where you want your system to go and how you want it to grow. Otherwise, you can end up somewhere else. So you can end up in left field instead of right field. So next, let's talk about maintaining a system of systems. So what is a system of systems? And why do you need one? Well, there's a lot that a design system has to do. It's quite, it does too much in my opinion, but a typical design system includes brand elements, components, guidance for content, design and UX models for governance, contribution. One small change can affect all of that. As the system gets larger and more teams start adopting the system, it can be a challenge to maintain one big set. Like, it's kind of like a cruise ship, right? The larger the cruise ship is, the harder it is to turn or stop immediately, and the same is with a design system that is starting to grow and become gigantic. The larger one centralized system gets, the more difficult or longer process it'll take to make subtle changes. And this can become a real bottleneck. In the past, I've worked on teams where we've been waiting for components to get contributed to core. There were deadlines that were missed because the team was running behind. And there was some really serious business implications because of that, because they missed their marketing launch goal. So what if we didn't have one large system, but a subset of smaller systems that make up the whole? This approach has been called decentralization and can help distribute ownership across teams. So this is a great quote from Oscar Gonzalez, who wrote an article on decentralizing design systems. He says the key lies not into abandoning centralized control entirely, but in thoughtfully redistributing responsibly and design-making power across the network. So basically, we're taking one large system and breaking it down into smaller chunks. These chunks should be treated separately, each having their own files and tools. Because of this, they end up being easier to maintain and have their own set of models, documentation, and components. The four main chunks are brand, base, pattern libraries, and templates, each feeding into the next down the line. So brand's at the very top, it feeds into base feeds into pattern libraries, and pattern libraries feed into templates. And brand and base are owned by centralized teams, where pattern libraries and templates are typically owned by product teams. So let's dive a little bit more into detail on this. So brand is the highest level. It contains all the styles and foundations that form a specific look and feel of a website. They tend to be shared company-wide, so not just digitally, sometimes it spans across print into other areas like environmental graphics. What's included in the system includes color, typography, image and illustration guidelines, icon sets, infographics, animation guidelines, and systems documentation. Brand is also the highest level when it comes to the system of systems, which basically means it's the hardest to get contributed back to. So what ends up happening is because it gets ingested into almost everything that the company produces, it's really hard to change this, right? Because if you change that color blue, that means it's got to change across the board when it comes to any marketing materials. So depending on the company size and setup, brand typically has its own set of maintainers, and it sits in the marketing side of things. So next, let's talk about our base components. These are the core level. They are a set of small atoms and molecules that inherit from brand. Carbon has under 45. So make that comparison between carbon, which has 45. The library I was working with had over 90. It was kind of ridiculous. So they provide a high-level guidance for layout, spacing, accessibility, theming, and use cases. The governance process isn't as strict as brand, but there should be an open and established process for others to contribute back to. And these are typically owned by a centralized team. So next we have our pattern libraries, and these are the most flexible. These are libraries that are assembled by other teams based on their needs. All the patterns are assembled using base components and inherent styles and guidance from brand. What's great about this library is it allows teams to govern and have their own set of maintainers, which takes pressure, time, and work off the base component team. And this helps keep the base component library staying lean and mean. The reason why Carbon can be 45 components and service everything it has to service is because it has those pattern numbers that are feeding off of it that are created for specific business use cases and specific user needs. Often when a pattern library is being built out or expanded, the team's going to seek feedback from the base component or brand team. They might create a gradient and decide like, hey, others might want to use this gradient. Maybe brand might want to use this gradient. So they'll go ahead and start the conversation with brand about like, hey, should you introduce this gradient so others can use it? Finally, we have templates. I call these the builder level. It's the end result of everybody's hard work. These are the people that are assembling the pages in the content management system or as developers on the ground level. They are page layouts that use components from pattern libraries to assemble the page. And then typically the team that's creating templates looks to the pattern library team for guidance to help identify any components that may need to be contributed back in templates. Because these are also the people that are creating the pages, they're the ones that can very easily identify if a component is working and not working and can communicate that up the chain. Because it's really hard to test these components in a way that is super flexible. So once these start going in the wild, usually in the past we've had like bi-weekly meetings where everybody gets in a room and they talk about like how things are working, what do we need to change. So you might be thinking to yourself, this all seems great. Like if we follow a system of systems, we won't have any challenges, right? Well, it comes with its own set of problems. As I mentioned, not everything is unicorn and rainbows in the stock. As the teams shift, as they grow, people roll off and off teams, they leave companies. Sometimes they're maintaining a component and they leave and nobody has pegged that person to take over that component. So what ends up happening is it becomes outdated. If you don't want to get into the weeds of design tokens when it comes to naming, and you just want to know like where can I start and get inspiration, there's this great website called Class Names that I've used in the past to get inspiration. It's actually kind of cool how it works and can really like stimulate the brain to think about like how I can approach naming things. Next, let's talk about challenges with content within the system at scale. This is also one of my favorite sections of the presentation. So before I dive deep into the challenges, I just want to point out an example that showcases one of the bigger things that we fear as systems designers. So I'm going to take our old buddy, the card component, and kind of use it as an example. The cards look great. We have an image, we have some headline text, we have some body copy, we have maybe some room for some tags, but like, wait a minute. What is happening with this card in the middle? Like, it has 3 paragraphs of text. The content guidance says 1 paragraph. How the heck did this person get away putting in with 3 paragraphs of text? And this is how I feel when I see something like that in the wild, where I'm just like, no, you're not supposed to do that. I'm sure we've all thought that way at some point. So this monstrosity of a card is actually a result of several challenges with content flexibility within the system. So the systems team can do a pretty good job providing content guidance when it comes to how much content can go within a component. But they can only test it if it's very limited. For example, like 1 or 2 use cases. So we can put some text in to see how everything moves and be like, you know what, this starts looking bad at like 1 paragraph. Let's give the content guidance 1 paragraph. As the system scales and more sites and teams start using the components, though, it becomes more difficult to maintain that flexibility with the content. And that's how you end up with a card with 3+ paragraphs. And what I've learned is teams will often test limitations of how much content a component can hold. And I've also seen this in the wild. So tag with 2 sentences. It's a tag. It gets 1 or 2 words max. not 2 sentences. Again, he was a screen designer, so. You must be thinking, but wait, we can solve this problem by providing the documentation, or maybe do something a little bit more drastic, so when the content hits a certain point, it starts to truncate. Yes, we could, but that comes with its own set of challenges. So I'm going to start with documentation around content guidance. You have to expect that nobody's going to read it. I've worked with content strategists or content authors who don't read the content guidance, mostly because it's too long, because you want to provide all the details. But if you make it too short, you leave out the important details, right? So they just test it out, just shove content in it, and they're like, oh, okay, this looks good. It doesn't look good. Okay, what about modifying the component when it reaches a certain character count? So a few examples of this is like truncating the content, or have the component actually break or shift when the content goes beyond the recommended max. I've worked on projects that have done this before, and let me tell you that the end results have not been good. A content author will launch with broken components because it doesn't look broke enough, right? And the author's like, how does this look broken? Because they went way beyond the recommended content that is supposed to go in it. And when they do care, just one little note here, when they do care, they start reaching out to you, right? And they're like, hey, why is this broken? Can I get an exception? Can you help me fix it? Can you change, can you help me fix my content? And you don't want to deal with that as a systems designer. So you may be asking yourself, like, why don't we just make the component super flexible, make it do all of the things, right? Make it hold 3 paragraphs, make it hold 10 paragraphs if they really wanted to. Well, this encourages abuse, laziness, and talking with developers about this, it adds a lot of maintenance overhead. So these are not great solutions, but they're nice to dream about. So finally, we're going to talk about challenges with governance and adoption at scale. As I mentioned, I'm not going to get too much in the weeds on this one, but I did want to mention a few things, challenges that I did run across. Determining governance between teams can be challenging, especially when you're not communicating between each other, and you're like, hey, you were supposed to come to us to get approval to change that component. And it becomes very, very awkward, and then the teams start hating each other. So you don't want that to happen. So you want to make sure everybody understands how they're supposed to govern and what they're supposed to govern. So contribution can also become challenging as teams scale. It might not be clear enough for others to contribute and how they can contribute. Or the process might be too complex or obscure. I've seen things where documentation around the system, contribution processes, and accessibility actually discourages others from contributing. Again, nobody wants to hop into a room and have 3 executive vice presidents join that meeting, and then they're like, I'm never doing that again. You also want to figure out how to get those to contribute who are first-time contributors or contributing up to brand. And I've seen a lot of more or less formal methods work for this. So like mentorships, one-on-ones. When working with Carbon, they had open office hours where everybody would just come in, share their work, get feedback. The less formal it feels, the more people want to contribute. And then finally, support and communication. Have you ever released an update to the system and then somebody Slack channels you and is like, hey, why is the background purple instead of blue? I think I found a bug. I'm like, no, actually it's not a bug. I sent out email communications about this a couple weeks ago. Obviously people don't read. And you don't mind helping that one person, but as more and more people start using the system and they start Slack messaging you, it becomes really annoying. So I've seen things like ServiceNow help be that like intern point where people submit bug tickets that they think that they're seeing, and then other people can pick them up to see like, hey, is this really an issue, or did people just not read my communication? So finally, I'm going to leave with this quote. This is by James Clear, who is an author on creating good habits. Some lessons have to be experienced to learn. The good, the bad. Not every design system is going to go perfectly. Just take what you learned and apply it to the next one. That'd be great. So these are all the resources that I mentioned throughout my presentation. I highly recommend you check them out. They are fantastic. And then I have a link to my presentation down there at the very bottom if you want to visit this at a later time. You can reach out to me, LinkedIn, and my email address if you have any questions that we don't get to or answer today. I'm super responsive, and I'm not on social media, so don't try to find me.